I'm David Dollar from the John L. Thornton China Center here at Brookings. In this panel, we're going to follow up on President Zheng's speech, and we're going to go a little bit more deeply into the Belt and Road Initiative. You have the bios, so I'll just make brief introductions here. I have an old friend of mine, Zhou-Yen Li, Vice Chairman of the International Finance Forum. Long record of working in the financial system in China. Very happy to have you here. Maggie Chun is Professor of Economics and International Affairs at George Washington University. She's doing interesting research on Belt and Road and other China-related topics. And then Marcus Rudlauer is Deputy Director of the Asia and Pacific Department at the IMF, and who's someone who's worked on China for a very long time. So I'm going to start with Zhou-Yen Li. I'm going to ask you the tough question. I get to travel to a lot of countries involved in the Belt and Road. Mostly I hear positive things about the infrastructure that China's financing. But in the West, you hear a lot of criticisms of the Belt and Road. President Zheng told us correctly that CDB is the largest development finance institution in the world, with more than $300 billion of loans outstanding to developing countries. But as a researcher, I find it hard to get all the information I need to study this. Which countries are getting the loans, what are the terms, what are the projects. So that's one of the criticisms from the West, is about transparency. So how would you respond to some of these critics from the West?
Okay, thank you for your question, Mr. Dollar. And I myself think that once new things comes out, and then criticism are there, and also and then different opinions on the new ideas, new theories, new strategies, and that's very normal. Because it will take time for the people to understand it. And a lot of area where they're trying to converge with it. And the strategy will be lasted too long. That's a long-term strategy that will take time for the people to understand. So I think that's normal. But in the area where we want to do is to need different government departments of each of the countries along the Belt and Road Initiative, and also for the countries where they would have closer business connections with China. We'll promote it among the countries and introduce more things to the people where they can benefit from it. In short, I will say that Belt and Road Initiative is long-term strategy. It will be shared by the people through common consultations on the projects where they can benefit from it. And also, it is part of the important projects of the common communities of the shared future for the mankind. So from this perspective, I think we would think about it, and we look at the things, because this is beneficial to the mankind, so we should think about it in a positive ways. Try to work along with the Belt and Road Initiative, especially the countries where they will benefit from it, and to talk to the Chinese partners and work along with it according to the political, economic, culture, and also finance, and especially the where the people-to-people exchanges among the countries. So we need a long-term persuasion, discussions, and introductions, like people to understand it. I think eventually it will benefit for the people where the Belt and Road Initiative launched. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me turn to Maggie. I'm going to ask Maggie talk a little bit about how the Chinese projects are similar to or different from other types of projects in the developing world. And then the real bottom line is how do developing countries get the most benefit out of these projects? Are there reforms or changes that could lead to greater benefits for some countries?
Sure, happy to. So one of the characteristics of Chinese investments or the BRI investments compared to the other types of investments we have seen in the past, I think, is the flexibility. I think the investment we have seen from the Belt and Road Initiative is that the investors are willing to go to countries where there might be some more instability and some risks. So in that sense, this type of investment offers these countries opportunity to access external financing when some of the other investors from the Western countries might be more hesitant and more averse. So I think that's one characteristic I would say that differentiates from the investments we have seen from Belt and Road Initiative from the other types of investments. And now the question is, how do we take advantage of these investments, the Belt and Road Initiative? I think in the long term, I do agree with Mr. Zhou that there is a great potential for these investments, which improve the connectivity, the geographic connectivity between countries and between people. There's a great potential for this type of investments to facilitate export growth, trade growth in general, and to help attract more investments, not just from China, but other countries around the world, not just in constructions, but also the general foreign direct investment in other sectors as well. And there's a great potential for these investments to help the BRI countries get integrated into the global value chains. So, however, the actual impacts of BRI on trade growth or FDI growth or integration into GVCs and ultimately economic growth will be contingent on a number of macro and micro factors. Okay? So those factors can range from the selection of the projects being funded, the implementation of the projects in a timely and cost-effective fashion, to things like the soft infrastructure of the host countries, the reforms, the supplementary reforms of these host countries to improve the business environment, the legal environment of the host countries, to the company, to the trade agreements between these countries. So I'm gonna just emphasize some of these factors. I will start with the soft infrastructure. Right, so we all know BRI is investing in the physical infrastructure, but I think it's important for the soft infrastructure to improve as well to reap the benefits of BRI. And this soft infrastructure would include, for example, the trade facilitation at the customs, right, to improve the efficiency of the trade customs. And it would also include the improvement of our business and legal regulatory environment for the foreign businesses and domestic businesses as well to do business in these countries. And it would also include improvement in transparencies. And so that's the soft infrastructure part. And then in the meantime, I think it's important for our countries to lower the trade barriers and investment restrictions. And if you look at the construction investment, some of my analysis has shown that there's great synergy between investment in construction and the general foreign direct investment. In other words, when investors go and invest to improve the infrastructure, that would help attract other investors to come to these countries. And the relationship can be, we estimate the relationship to be like a 10% increase in construction investment can lead to a 7% increase in general foreign direct investment from around the world. So there's great synergy between these two types of investment. And I think it is important for the destination countries to take advantage of these synergies by lowering the barriers to investment and the barriers to trade. But if you look at the FDI policy across BRI countries and compare that to the high-income OECD countries, you do find the BRI countries tend to have, on average, more restrictive and burdensome FDI policy than some of most of the high-income OECD countries, and that is seen in terms of starting a foreign business, accessing industry land, and arbitrating commercial disputes. However, there is great heterogeneity across BRI countries. Some countries are relatively more open, but there are countries that are relatively more restrictive. And another aspect is, in order to reap the benefits from construction investment or general FDI in these developing countries, absorptive capacity is very important. There is extensive literature showing that the gains from investment will depend on the local linkages between foreign investors and the domestic industries, right? And these linkages include the backward linkages, for example, from the downstream investment to the upstream domestic sectors. And it also includes forward linkages from the upstream investment by the foreign investors to the downstream domestic sectors. So having strong linkages between local sectors and foreign investors will be crucial for the destination countries to reap the benefits from investment. And then lastly, I want to comment a little bit on the trade agreements. We are talking about, there's a lot of bilateral deals being discussed at the moment between BRI countries. And it's perhaps safe to say that it's not likely in the short term for us to see a gigantic trade agreement between all the BRI countries just because of the diversity of countries being involved. But I think it's important for us to think in that direction because bilateral trade deals, bilateral transportation deals included, will create a very complicated web of rules for the companies to navigate. So I think it is important for us to think about trade deals that involve multiple countries so we can simplify the rules and to increase the utilization of these deals by the companies.
Okay, thank you, Maggie. That was very helpful. One of Maggie's points right at the beginning was that China seems to be, willing to go into risky environments. It's less risk averse than Western investors. I found that in my own research. So that kind of
got to cite your research.
No, that's okay. You don't have to cite my research, but I'm glad we found a consistent result and we don't have to argue. But it leads naturally to what I want to ask Marcus, because economists, we like to joke that central banks, their job is to take away the punch bowl before the party gets out of hand, right? And the IMF is the world's central bank, effectively. So the question for you, Marcus, is the party getting out of hand? Meaning, are there going to be debt problems, debt sustainability issues that arise from this lending? Can the developing countries that are deeply involved, can they afford this? And what is the IMF advising?
So what you meant to say is that the IMF is the world's party pooper. Get it. Well, thanks for inviting us, David. This is a great forum, and it's certainly a big issue for us. Two parts to this question. The answer were first the facts, and then what to do about it. The facts, obvious. This is a key risk. That's sustainability. It's a risk that's not unique to the BRI. It's a risk that is associated, obviously, with any large-scale lending, financing, public or private, to developing countries, emerging markets, and some advanced economies as well. What's special about the BRI is the scope of this that makes it globally macro-relevant and certainly bilaterally for individual countries relevant. It reaches into a number of countries that are already at high debt, public debt and external debt. Some of those countries, and they're in the double digits, are in some indicators already breaching the fund's what we call critical debt sustainability indicators. If you know our methodology of debt sustainability analysis, we have some thresholds where we measure the exposure of countries to debt sustainability problems, and some of those BRI partner countries are there already, and some of them are already at beyond it. And in some of those, obviously, China's financing and China's exposure is a significant part of the debt in those countries. So it is a key risk, both for China and for the partner countries. For China, the risk obviously is not to get repaid, but I think it goes beyond that. There's reputational issues. There is the risk of having a negative impact rather than a positive one when for individual partner countries, as we know, debt goes beyond a sustainable level. The debt service burden not just detracts from important social and other spending needs in the fiscal accounts, but it also does wider damage to confidence, to investment, to growth, and so forth. So it is a key risk. What to do about it, or let's say maybe what not to do about it. I think it's clearly not a reason for not to have a BRI. Or even for no BRI engagement in those countries already at risk of debt sustainability. But of course, it's important to pay attention, and the question is how to do it. And there are issues of project, and many of those have already been mentioned in some form or another by Maggie and Mr. Zhou. There's issues of how to select projects, how to finance them, how to implement them, how to monitor the exposures, and how to resolve problems if they occur on debt sustainability and debt service. So for BRI partner countries, this points squarely to the issue of fiscal management, macro fiscal and micro fiscal management. It's very important that these BRI projects in the partner countries be embedded in a sustainable fiscal framework, that they are transparently accounted for, planned for, and embedded in a fiscal regime that has clear and transparent fiscal rules and fiscal sustainability objectives and policies. And that's one area where the fund can put some value added in building those. Second issue, project selection. We were in Beijing last week, and Madame Lagarde, our managing director, had an opening speech at a BRI conference that discussed this issue with a number of BRI partner countries and senior senior officials from China. And perhaps the key challenge and technical weakness or capacity gaps in BRI countries was the issue of project selection. To make sure that project selection is not driven by particular interests, by the governance problems, big corruption in some areas, make sure that these are projects that are rigorously selected based on a transparent cost-benefit analysis. Because obviously the key issue for that sustainability is what kind of returns do these projects bring. In the best of circumstances, you can load up on debt, but if you get more out of it in terms of economic returns and debt service capacity, you're fine. So project selection is key. And if you do that well, and again, here the fund has developed certain tools, public investment management tools where we can help, and the World Bank and others can certainly help capacity building in those BRI countries. And one of the key themes that came out of our discussion last week was the great thirst of BRI partner countries to enhance their own capacities of project selection and project management. One other important point I need to mention here for both BRI and for China is the financing structure. Obviously, when you are lending and engaging in a country that already has high debt, you probably need to think of different financing arrangements and structures, more concessional debt, more equity kind of contributions, or equity kind type of contributions than financing arrangements, which, by the way, if you finance them in renminbi, are not cheap, both because of the interest rates, of course, in China is somewhat higher than global interest rates, and the risk or the prospect of, in the long run, renminbi appreciation over time. So that can make Chinese debt more expensive even than other debt. For China, it will be critical, and we know that President Xi was here, and we heard this last week as well, and we know it from our contact. China is already quite diligent and working very hard to enhance their own ability to monitor credit exposures. That's a challenge for China because, in part, these BRI and other foreign lending activities are quite decentralized and are not totally coordinated, to say it lightly. So for China to monitor the credit exposure in their countries, developing that capacity more and coordinating it better is a challenge, and this is important, both for direct government lending, but also for all the other indirect government lendings that are going on through state banks and through development banks and other funds. Then to find the right financing structure, we talked about that. And third, when debt service problems start to occur or are in prospect, to find a way of coordinating the debt resolution in a better way with other lenders. We have had challenges on that, now that international lenders outside the traditional fora of debt resolution, which has been the Paris Club, as other lenders like China become more important. And when debt service problems occur, the resolution of those and the coordination of those problems is a challenge. And I think working with China on doing that in a better, more coordinated way is another challenge going forward. I think one important step of helping China, for China helping itself to coordinate all this better in China, was taken a few weeks ago when the decision was taken to create this new state agency for the coordination of China's foreign aid, BRI activities, and China's role as a creditor. that new ministry, that new agency that's supposed to coordinate all these various lending activities, I think will be an important focal point for exactly these kind of tasks that China faces in managing its exposures going forward.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. So let me come back to Zhou-Yen Li. So to put this in perspective, I think the projects are working well in some countries, but not so well in others. I visited Uganda last year, and some of the projects were going very well, the Kampala-Entebbe Expressway. Ethiopia seems to have had some successful projects. But then we hear about long delays and problems with implementation in other countries. So my question for you is very frank. Is China worried about losing money? And is China adapting in the light of these different experiences? These institutions like China Development Bank, their core business initially was funding infrastructure in China. Mm-hmm. And I used to co-finance projects with them. They do that very, very well. But the environment in other countries is very different.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question again. And in my perspective, I think, my background in the insurance regulatory area, where I've never ever done any investment in the specific project in the countries where you mentioned, in Uganda and some other countries in African continent. But Mr. Zheng was absent from us. If he were there, he would talk about more specifically and let you know the details about the project, where the secret is the successful story of their investments and the financing, and where there's an unsuccessful story where they are doing some investment in the projects. But in my perspective, I think once investment is successful, is better cooperations between the investors and in the area where they invested, authorities, companies, entities, and also cultural environment too. All these are put together, and all elements, you can maneuver well, that will be a successful story. But, for the countries where in the African countries, they need more education about international practices of investment, and they would understand how international business practices is doing right now, and they would up to date themselves to understand how the project is going forward. I think that's what we want to do in the first foremost. And the second is that we should make careful, in-depth, concrete feasibility studies for the project where you want to invest. And first of all, they would understand any project you do in the countries where they want to have the support from the local people and to meet the needs of economic development and the people's livelihood, to solve the problem of economic development. Also, this area where they should make a detailed feasibility study first hand, so that they can make it more smooth and suitable for the investors. And for the people where they have investors from outside of the country, like in China or some other countries in developed economies, they should talk about the several costs and the conditions first, whether they are able to do it in the sustainable way or not. I think that's the area where they should, have face-to-face meetings in the first hand, so that they can avoid misunderstandings between the two and make, bad things occurred once the project is going on. So first and foremost, I will, in conclusion, that we would make number one, detailed studies first, and come out with a feasibility study which is suitable to the economic environment and the people's needs, and also environment where they would invest in there. And the third one is in the long-term sustainabilities, we should look at the futures, whether it's suitable or not. So I think the question is, we can write a book about it, about how well we can make success stories of a project where we try to avoid the mistakes and the secrets of unsuccessful stories of projects. Thank you very much for your questions.
Okay, thank you. Maggie, I don't know if you can answer this, but I'm gonna ask it. The Belt and Road primarily involves countries in Asia and secondarily Europe. I think a couple countries in East Africa are included, but it's basically countries in Asia and Europe. Up until recently, most of China's development lending was in Latin America and Africa. So my question is China pulling back from Latin America and Africa in order to do the Belt and Road, or is the Belt and Road kind of an addition to what China was already doing? So I mean, this is something that people in Latin America ask me. Is sort of China losing interest and pulling out of some parts of the world?
Well, I can only comment based on my personal conjecture. To me, I think, in my view, these are parallel initiatives. I don't necessarily think one would crowd out the other. I think they probably have a different, they are motivated by slightly different objectives, economic, geopolitical objectives. Their emphasis would be a little different between the investment in BRI countries and the investment in Latin America. I don't necessarily think there will be a significant crowding out effect. I mean, there might be some competition for sure, because you do have a limited amount of, you do have a finite amount of capital to invest, right? But I think because of the differences in the nature of the investments and the differences in the emphasis, I don't think there will be a very strong crowding out effect. But that's just my personal conjecture. And I don't want to bet on it.
Right. So my impression is the same as Maggie's, but I think, you know, if we had more consistent data, you know, coming out from the Chinese government about, you know, all of the different loans and projects, then we'd actually be able to see is China pulling back. But thank you for answering that. Marcus, I'm going to turn to the audience in a moment, so think of your questions, and my staff should get microphones ready. But let me ask Marcus. When your managing director was in China, one of her objectives, I believe, was to launch a new $50 million technical assistance facility funded by China and implemented by the IMF, as I understand it. So I'd like Marcus to tell us a little bit more about that. Are you going to build a nice new building over there on Financial Street in Beijing? What is the $50 million going to go to, and who's actually going to be deciding and organizing this? Maybe it'll be a nice job for you, huh?
Oh, yeah, that's the last thing we want to do, to build that building in China. But this is, however, very important for us. This may not be known that capacity development actually is more than a third of the IMF's budget. And increasingly, this budget is financed not by advanced economies, but by outside contributions from countries. And in this context, for some time, we have been discussing with China how China's role as a recipient, poor country, for this assistance can transform itself into becoming a leader and a contributor to that. And early last year, early 2017, we finally got the word from the leadership that China has decided now to contribute substantially to the IMF's capacity building efforts in Africa. Contribute a significant amount of money for that directly to our Africa capacity development centers, and about half of this money would go to capacity building in the so-called China IMF Capacity Development Center. It's taken me a year to learn this, to say that quickly, CICDC. To launch this center in China, as you said, fully financed by Chinese contributions, supposed to do two things. To train Chinese officials in the various areas of where we have capacity development, fiscal, financial, monetary, financial sector issues, but also other senior officials from other countries. Have them both to come to China for this training, but also do events and training courses in those countries. For example, we are looking at some venue in the Middle East where we can now have a course on these BRI issues where we can help countries do exactly what we want to do. So, as I said, this is both finance in China. The capacity development center that we have in China is a virtual center. It's a coordination mechanism where we have planning. But then we also have two facilities already. One, an old one in Dalian, where the fund has done training courses for a while, that exists. And the Chinese are now just in the middle of building their own training center in Shenzhen, in the south, so that officials can easily travel there from the southern parts of China for this kind of training. So we will have training courses in China and also outside of China. So again, this is important for us in two ways. One, of course, it gives us more budget for doing our CD activities in important areas and countries. But second, also, I think it's a symbol of China's changing engagement at the IMF and in the international system. It's a positive step for bringing China into the system, transforming its role as a recipient and bystander to one who is actively contributing. We have seen that in the SDR a couple of years ago. We've seen it in the increase of China's participation in the quota and in the voice in the IMF. So we think this is an important additional step in that right direction of having China actively participate at the IMF and feel at home in an institution that they themselves shape.
Okay, thank you. All right, we can turn to the audience for questions about the Belt and Road Initiative. I see this hand first. Oh, please just briefly identify yourself, and let's have relatively pithy questions.
Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. A question to Mr. Zhu. You talk about this being a once-in-a-generation, a rejuvenation, benefit for all of humankind, and I would love to see it as a brand like that. The Chinese dream being the English-speaking dream, every youth dream. So how do we get this to youth? Because when I go to Beijing, youth understand it in China, but when I talk to American youth or English-speaking youth, no one's even aware of it, let alone how to experience it. So is there a way to put Belt Road conferences into education summits as well as into banking summits or something like that?
Okay. Thank you again for your good questions. Well, talk about the terms of once in a generation, which is not a normal term Chinese government officially use, but it is, come up with ideas from the survey, from the central bank publications, and a lot of central bank respond with the concept and their views on the Belt and Road Initiative as a once-in-a-generation project and initiative. So people, I think, look at the things in a very positive ways, where once a Belt and Road Initiative will last long and will assist where the countries can benefit from it. And especially at the central bank's level, they will have such ideas. And also from the central bank response, there's some of the ideas that they need advise the local government and local policy makers. They will understand what is the Belt Road Initiative. To be frank with you, may not be everybody knows, especially from the Belt and Road countries at central government levels, but it need education. Even in China, you said that need more education, so like people to understand more about it, and perhaps you talked with some youth who is speak English but may not understand that fully. So I think in China also we need more, promotions and publications and let people to understand it. But that's the important job where we should work on it in the future and consistently let people to understand how Belt and Road Initiative will benefit. It's not only for the people, for the countries where 46 or even 60 countries where they will benefit from it. But Chinese people also can, on the basis of opening up policies and Belt and Road Initiative projects, and they will benefit from the two. So it will take a long time to do so, and the younger the better, the earlier the better to educate the people to understand that. To be frank with you, the next year there will be a second International Belt and Road Initiative Summit will be held in Beijing again. There will be more and more participants from the central government level, maybe the government heads and president of the countries will participate. I myself are here at Brookings institutions. I call on the more American people can participate in such a project. So we can work along with it because we think is, there's a common community of the shared future of mankind. I think we can work along with it and to solve the problems of, in trade or in other area investments, and also in the services, international cooperations. So we need more things to collaborate together to solve these things. Again, thank you very much. Your suggestions is good, and we can do more education let people to understand, even from younger generations. Thank you.
Okay, other questions? That woman there, way.
I think this is a great question. A question probably that should be directed to Mr. Zhou. So I think this is a core question. What's the definition of BRI project and how it is classified? I'm not aware of a clear definitive definition of BRI projects, but I might not have all the insights. But my understanding is that China or maybe the China Development Bank or some other agencies in China are currently putting together a database that keeps track of all the projects that are classified under the BRI initiative. But for my own analysis, I think for the analysis that might exist at the moment is we are looking at basically all investments, construction investments, and general FDI that are happening in BRI countries and invested by China. So we are not able to really distinguish between BRI projects versus non-BRI projects at the moment.
Yeah, I would just, sorry, Mr. Zhou, you want to add?
Add just a few words. Talking about the Belt and Road Initiative project, it's not only project only. We should think about at least another 4 areas. Economic cooperation is one thing. The others, people-to-people exchange, cultural exchange, financial cooperations, and also government financial and monetary policy exchanges are also the area where we can cooperate with each other, especially among the Belt and Road countries. So the project maybe is what we call the platform, can doing something there. But it involved a lot of elements where they need money, that's a monetary policy. They need a cultural exchange, and they need green environment improvements, and also they need banking, insurance cooperations in the area where we can solve the possible risk occurred in the project going on. We can do something more in that area. I think it needs more elements to think about it, to solve any problem in the project financing and culture exchange, environment improvement, and the people-to-people culture exchange is also an area we consider to solve the problem.
So I just
Good question.
Very good question. I just add quickly. So in my research, I distinguish between the direct investment and then the lending for infrastructure, which are mostly sovereign loans. It's an interesting question whether direct investment is going to BRI countries, but I think of that as inherently commercial, not part of some plan. And the sovereign lending, that's what's financing most of these infrastructure projects. This gentleman here.
Thank you. This is DeWardrick McNeil, Longview Global LLC. My question is actually for Professor Chen, and it involves some of the labor and employment aspects of the BRI. And David asked a question about the difference between what we're seeing with respect to BRI versus Latin America and Africa. About 2 years ago, I was in Dar es Salaam and visited Addis, and I looked at some of the infrastructure projects that the Chinese are participating in there. And I noticed a very heavy load of Chinese on those projects, right up and down the skill set, even down to driving water trucks or spraying down the clay roads. And I'm wondering if as we're looking at BRI projects, are we seeing more local labor being employed, particularly for some of the low-skill stuff that happens on these projects? And this was a big complaint when I was in Dar es Salaam, less so in Addis, but certainly in Dar es Salaam. People wondered why local Africans can't drive a water truck, for example. So I'm wondering, have the Chinese heard some of those complaints in Latin America, Africa, particularly Africa, and are adjusting the way in which they arrange labor for some of the BRI projects?
So I actually just came from another event before this one, which was focusing on the investment FDI in Africa. And one of the characteristics mentioned there is the Chinese villages in Africa, that are brought from China to be involved in these projects. So I think that is definitely true, a characteristic of Chinese investment in Africa. I don't have first-hand data to compare investment in Africa versus investment in BRI in terms of the labor involvement, but I would, again, personal conjecture, I would imagine that would not be less the case in BRI countries on average. Just again because of I think partly because of the characteristics of the destination countries and perhaps the nature of the projects, as well as the cultural relations or ties between the destination countries and China. These all would play a role in the approach China would adopt in implementing the projects. And I do think that involving local labor market and would be important for maximizing the gains for the local economies, because this is part of the linkages that I talk about between the foreign investors and the domestic sectors.
The gentleman standing in the back.
My name is Paul Gallagher with Executive Intelligence Review. If we consider a country with a really crippling lack of investment in new infrastructure of the Belt and Road kind, namely the United States, and the suggestions that have been made for 2 years now by various Chinese to invest China's holdings of Treasury securities of one sort or another in investment in infrastructure here in the United States. Could the United States not create a national institution, a national bank or institution, which would allow the conversion of long-term Treasury holdings, whether they be Chinese, Japanese, U.S. commercial banks, would allow those holdings to be converted into equity in such an institution in order to actually bring the United States into the Belt and Road Initiative?
Anyone want to tackle that?
I think this question is for governor of a central bank. But, since we are all here, I think each of us should say a few words and try to meet your requirement and your questions. But in my perspective, I think China and the U.S. Need to more cooperate, especially on infrastructure constructions, where I think there were a few successful projects going on for China automobile and also rolling stocks companies. They are working with Chicago. I can't remember
I think Chicago,
exactly.
that's right. Yeah.
Some of the cities in the United States are working on the project. But maybe you want to fix your expressways and express railroad, and we can cooperate on it. Right now, China has a longer express railroad constructions is going on, but they need more cooperation. So it's not only for China only, but once international travelers they are going to China, they can use more rapid and quicker transportation facilities. I think they will feel enjoyable. So even in the States, more and more Chinese tourists would like to come to States for sightseeing, for visits, for studies. I think United States is the largest destination of education for the Chinese children. So there will be more and more they will come. So they would work along with it. They serve the bridges between the two countries in the future, especially through Belt and Road initiatives. They will bear the responsibility to do so. But talking about monetary policies, especially treasury bills, even without the Belt and Road initiative, China is also the largest amount of treasury bills holders of the United States. But we will continue to do so in the similar ways. In quantity-wise, they would think about whether it is treated in government, market environment. That's the decision making for the, once they hold it, the price is okay or not, they can make a profit or not. So that's the decision making. But from this area, China is largest foreign reserve holders, and they need international environment assets to invest in the area where they can to keep the stable prices of the U.S. Treasury bills, so that they can meet the investment criteria of central banks, of foreign reserves, and also for the futures of the cooperations with the United States. Maybe Federal Reserve, so they need to do so, and perhaps the closer cooperation on this side. Right now, IMF meetings here is going on, so I'm also the attendees of these meetings. I will enjoy more information from that. I think that will be great area where we can cooperate, especially in the area of monetary policies and also treasury bills holdings, and also in the future they have larger room to extend the cooperations between the two central bankers. Thank you.
Okay.
Good question. That's
this woman here.
Anchi Hao from the Library of Congress, but I'm just doing individual research on Belt Road Initiative. I understand that there are over 70 countries that are involved in, or jurisdictions that are involved in the project, but I want to narrow it down to the Middle East. I can see that a lot of the, like Iran and Iraq, will be interested in infrastructure investment. But what would be other countries, such as Qatar, Saudi Arabia, what would be the draw for them to be participating in BRI? Thanks.
Anyone want to take that? I mean, well, Marcus?
I think generally, maybe not exactly Saudi Arabia, but there's many, many countries where the obvious issues meet. Very large financing capacity on the part of China, huge experience in managing large and complex projects and implementing them quickly and efficiently, and major investment needs. So if you look at all the stans, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, all these countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the various corridors that Belt and Road, and even though it's 70 countries plus, reaching even into Africa, South America, clearly a major focus is the Middle East and the land bridge to Europe. So all these countries in that area, I think there is an obvious need and capacity on China's side. The issue is how to make them meet efficiently. So I don't see why many countries in the Middle East would not want to be involved.
Right, but would you agree that Saudi Arabia, which is flush with money, is countries like that are probably not going to borrow from China, right?
Yeah, I don't want to comment on specific countries because I haven't talked to Saudi Arabians, so I don't want to prejudge. But from that point of view, it's not that obvious.
This woman here.
Thank you. My name is Christine Akenisch from the German Development Institute. I'm with a background in China-Africa relations. I found it very interesting that you mentioned the question of project selection and soft infrastructure as key challenges for making BNR projects sustainable and making sure that the broader population benefits from these projects. And very often, it's not a question, first and foremost, of capacities, but of political interests that are driving project selection. And I mean, there is an interest in transparency, a political interest in transparency at some point. So I would be interested from your discussions with Chinese officials, whether you see that there is a growing recognition of this problem of the political economy of infrastructure investments and how this is addressed. Because, ultimately, very often it's a political challenge, not first and foremost of capacity challenge.
So let me say a few words on that. So I think Maggie and I are both in the same situation that a lot of these questions we have impressions, but it's hard to get hard data, right? So, my impression is as I said, projects are working quite well in many developing countries, and they tend to be the ones that have better governance by different measures. And then there are some countries, Venezuela, Chinese lending to Venezuela has just not worked out at all. And Mozambique now is in serious debt problems. So what I want to suggest is I think this is a learning experience. I think the Chinese institutions have gone into some very risky environments, and in some cases they're making the projects work, and in other cases it's not working. And I'm speculating that China is going to be practical and respond to that. And within Latin America, for example, China's lending more to Brazil, and it's as far as I can see, it's not lending any new money to Venezuela. So I think China's learning from this experience, and that its allocation is going to move away from some of the countries where the capacity is really not sufficient to deal with this kind of large scale. But that's a little bit speculative because it is so hard to get information, and these things it's also just changing very quickly in real time. Anyone else want to add to that?
That's true. I think it's a huge learning curve for any investment, for any investor, right? And especially given the magnitude of the investment we're talking about and the diversity of the 70-something countries we're talking about. I think some of that is perhaps, I don't know whether it's the political economy, but some of that I think is genuinely trying to know the market, learn the investment environment, and then, and you don't want to be too out there unless you are confident that this project is going to take off.
And I myself will remind everybody, I think you want to do the things, I think you should know the things well. If you do not know the things, you don't do the things. So I think that's the rule everybody should observe.
That's a good point. Yeah. As I said, I had a lot of experience working in partnership with China Development Bank in China. We built a lot of good stuff, So I think that taking the experience of what China does well out to other countries, as Marcus said, it's potentially very, very valuable. I think we take one more question. We're running a little bit ahead of schedule, which I view as a good thing. We'd scheduled a 10-minute tea break. I was always nervous about that because you don't really get people back in 10 minutes. So let's take one more question, and then we'll have a slightly longer break. This woman here.
Thank you very much. I'm Marina Fazal, an Afghan-American journalist. I would like you to put in context, please, the way that the One Belt, Ubud One Belt, One Road can best affect Afghanistan. And you all just talked about how there are situations where the political circumstances might not spell out a profitable or verifiable circumstance, and that we must know best what we are doing before we get involved. Yet so many conflicts around the world, like the one in my country, having become the longest war of America, depends on making investment and long-term investment. Thank you.
Okay, the question is about Afghanistan, right? Yeah.
That's a hard question, hardest questions, especially from journalists. Well, I think for Belt Road Initiative, there will be the things in the first priority can do, and the last priority you can do later. So you should put things in good order, and once the condition is mature, you can do first. Once the condition is not mature, you can do later. And you can use a successful investment, a successful story to educate where they need to make the condition mature, the countries where they can do better in the future. Well, specifically about the countries, I think it's a little bit difficult to say more things about it. Personally, I've never, ever been that country, Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Marcus, you mentioned the Central Asia in general. Do you want to add anything on this? I'm afraid probably none of us is really an expert in Afghanistan, but...
Not really. My sense is that, as was mentioned here, that Chinese are working very, very hard to become much more deliberate in judging ex ante at which time, under what conditions, to select which projects and how to finance them. And I think the experience, obviously, is that when you have a post-conflict situation where there is major security problems, I think, you know, as you said, you do the most important things first before you have the conditions to have a really good project. But so I don't want to specifically comment any more about Afghanistan. I think project selection certainly is one, the political conditions surrounding that. But once that's done, equally important or even more important then, of course, is, you know, how do you implement it? How transparent and level playing field are you in your procurement selection? There's huge scopes for things actually going off the track even after that. And the CSIS has done very important work on that. And you look at what has happened traditionally on well-managed projects, for example, projects that have the collaboration either by the private sector or by the multilateral development banks that are co-financed. You see a certain structure of procurement, of project implementation. For example, I think the average Chinese participation in those kind of projects is about 1/3 Chinese contractors, 1/3 international contractors. In the BRI, tends to be 4/5 Chinese. Now, some of that is also changing because just Chinese contractors are becoming so much more competitive. So if you have a truly open level playing field procurement system, you actually select Chinese contractors because they're the most efficient and cheapest. That's also part of the reason why I think 4 out of the 5 largest international contracting firms today are Chinese. So part of that is the reality of Chinese development and growth, but then there is also an issue of openness and transparency in the procurement to make sure that these projects work efficiently everywhere where you do them. So everybody, I think, here is learning. And as I said, one of the key demands that we got last week in the conference from all these BRI partner countries is the thirst for capacity building in how to prepare themselves for dealing with the Chinese once they're ready to come in. How do they structure their procurement? How do they get ready for contract negotiations to make sure things are working out efficiently?
Yeah, it's a really good point to end on. I mean, I've heard this from a lot of developing countries. They want advice on how they can get the most benefit, out of the Chinese financing, the Chinese projects. And it's incumbent on developing countries to have their own good management and good governance if they're really going to benefit from this. So let's close now, and that way we can take a 15-minute break. And I encourage you to come back. We haven't even talked about the U.S.-China trade war yet. Okay?
That's really
so
good.
we're holding that off as a teaser, okay? So this has been really fascinating discussion of the Belt and Road. Let's give our panelists a big hand.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.